Up next tonight, the 5 Live Formula 1 team preview the Belgian Grand Prix.
Formula 1 on 5 Live.
Hello and welcome to the Spa-Francorchamps circuit here in Belgium. It's about 45 minutes drive southeast from Liège. I can vouch for that because I did it this morning in my reasonably priced hire car. And the circuit is nestled in the beautiful, picturesque Ardennes forest. And it is the setting for the last race before the summer shutdown. And normally, I have to say, when we're approaching the summer holidays, everyone's quite keen to get through that final race. But I think this year it's a little bit different because we've had a few days to gather our thoughts after the Hungarian Grand Prix last weekend. And I think there are still some big questions to be answered. And I'm glad I've got some experts alongside me to answer those questions in the form of F1 TV's Will Buxton and the race's Scott Mitchell-Marm. Guys, I don't know about you, but normally we're a little bit tired of the monotony of the last few seasons and the summer break can't come quickly enough, but it's not so this weekend for the Belgian Grand Prix.
I don't want it to end. Well, I do. I'm really looking forward to a bit of holiday. But no, I mean, we have a fight. We have a championship. We've had 7 winners in 13 races. We are having a phenomenal season and an unexpectedly phenomenal season. When you looked at how it started and how dominant Red Bull was again, I think we all feared a repeat of last year, but what a year, Scott. I know it's just been amazing.
It's a hell of a turnaround. Do you think that we were all kind of, well, with the exception of perhaps Max and Red Bull, worried that the first couple of races or 2 or 3 races would have set the tone for a season of domination yet again? And it was feeling a little bit like how have Mercedes dropped the ball this much, probably worse than ever than the first 2 seasons in terms of how they started. McLaren doesn't seem to have built on sort of the end of 2023 promise. Ferrari's kind of Ferrari, so you're just a little bit worried, like, well, you know, they're there but they're not quite there. And then all of a sudden we get to the summer break, or we might have another one this weekend, but I think we've had 7 different winners now, which is, I think it's the first time since 2012, and I think it's only the 4th time since 2000 this has happened.
Yeah, it's the first time since 2003 that we've had 2 winners from 3 teams. Yeah. So both drivers winning for 3 separate teams.
It's remarkable to have this level of variety and this level of competition. I'd be surprised if we have a drivers' championship fight in my heart of hearts, but we've got a brilliant race-by-race narrative now.
See, I reckon there is hope for a drivers' fight, but McLaren have got to get everything right, and that ultimately is where they have fallen short this half of the season.
I love it. I can actually sense the excitement. It's sort of bubbling over at the table.
I'm not even
here.
having to force it. This is genuine.
Do you know what? As I was packing my suitcase, my husband said to me, could be an exciting race this weekend. And I sort of flipped into default, like, yeah. And I was like, no, actually, you're right. You are right. This could be an exciting race again.
Every weekend we're coming into with that expectation now. And it's just, it's wonderful to see. You know, new regulations were brought in a couple of years ago that were designed to close up the field, that were designed to make it more difficult for the top team to develop in season, that were supposed to allow the smaller teams, the midfield teams, to catch up, and in a very short space of time we're seeing that field really start to bunch together to the point where, you know, Scott was saying, start of the season it looked like Mercedes were nowhere. Lewis and George have both got Grand Prix victories. McLaren have pulled around a disappointing start to be the fastest car in Formula 1. Ferrari have got a couple of wins on the board, and Red Bull, from that point of domination, are struggling and looking at potentially making a driver change mid-season. I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah, and you talk about those 7 different winners. If it was 8, you would include Sergio Perez, but it's not. So it's the teams you don't expect to have got those double wins. It's Red Bull who haven't. It's only Max Verstappen who's chalked one up for Red Bull.
Yeah, and that's exactly why Checo is under pressure, as Will said. It's an extraordinary position for the world champion team that has still got a healthy lead in both championships, has dominated this era of Formula 1, considering changing driver. That's remarkable for starters, but it is a reflection of exactly what we're talking about. The heat is on. You know, the fight isn't coming. The fight's already here, and Red Bull can't fight one-handed. McLaren has taken a massive chunk out with the 1-2 finish in Hungary, and if anything, Red Bull's lucky that it was McLaren that had a slow-ish start to the season, because they've been outscoring Red Bull for a while now. But they started from such a low base that they weren't even second best in the championship. So it's not just McLaren that has to get everything right to get Lando into the Drivers' Championship. Red Bull has to get everything right to cling on to the constructors, and that is exactly why it's having this consideration.
And had McLaren actually taken the chances that they've squandered this season, there's every chance we could be going into the summer break with McLaren leading the Constructors' Championship. There were a couple of races which they might not have had a go at. We sort of look at Monaco and Austria as two races where they may have, but I think Canada was a race they should have won. Silverstone was a race they should have won with either driver, and Imola is a race that they potentially could have won if they had got everything right, got all their strategic decision making spot on. They could be leading the Constructors' Championship going into this summer break.
Oh, there are so many storylines bubbling away, and even within each storyline there are subplots, aren't there, as well? And so we're going to tackle one of the biggest storylines, I think, of the last week, and that's McLaren, the 1-2 that they scored in Hungary. Oscar Piastri taking his maiden win in Formula 1 ahead of his teammate Lando Norris, but of course it came shrouded in controversy. Now that you've had a few days to reflect on it, maybe listen back to the radio messages between Lando Norris and his race engineer Will Joseph, do you think McLaren should have let Lando Norris win? Should they have been focusing on the Drivers' Championship that could eventually come their way? Should Lando have given it back sooner? Should we relive that whole race again? Let's have a little chat about it.
Well, I think we have slightly different positions on this, so I'm going to let you go first.
Okay,
because then you can lay your
well.
point out and I can eviscerate it. So.
Perfect.
Mildly eviscerated.
I think the great sadness with Hungary is that what should have been Oscar Piastri's crowning moment in Formula 1 was taken from him by an unnecessary situation. McLaren had no need to pit Lando first. They had no need to cover Lewis Hamilton. The stats bear it out. The numbers bear it out. There was no threat. They panicked. And in doing so, they created this situation entirely of their own making that made it look like Oscar was being handed the win, despite the fact he'd absolutely dominated the race. He'd driven beautifully. But should Lando have held on? Should they have ordered the positions to be reversed? I firmly believe that McLaren for some time should have chosen a number one, and Lando should have been picked as that number one. I was arguing it back in Austria, and then it was the sprint, and then it was only 1 point. I was like, why are you letting your drivers fight? World Championships have been won by less than a point. So why are you letting your number two take points off your number one? And Hungary again was a situation for me where they let their number two take points off their number one. You've got the 1-2 locked in, you've got your points for the constructors. But Lando, if McLaren keep scoring as they are, if Red Bull keep faltering as they are, and if McLaren can actually start to make the right decisions, the calm decisions in race, yes, it's a huge gap, but it's not irreversible. And I think they need to back Norris. And that doesn't come from the fact that I'm a Brit and Lando's a Brit. No, I want to see a World Championship fight. I'm desperate to see a World Championship fight. And I want them to back him and say, Oscar, your time is coming.
It's the competitive and optimistic take, definitely, and you have to kind of. I think you do have to be bold when you're competing in F1 for World Championships. You don't just get handed them. That's not how it works. But I guess history would say that it is irreversible. Nobody's come back from a gap this big at this stage. Yeah, exactly. No, right. So, but I think. It's fascinating to me because I don't actually think there is a concrete right or wrong on this, because it's a really interesting test of short term versus long term. Because the short term is basically, we're in a championship fight here. No, let's go for it. Lando's ahead in the championship by quite a long way over Oscar. Let's just commit to it now. And if they commit to that earlier, then Hungary does play out differently, and they should handle Hungary differently. The long term view is, are we going to get everything that we need out of Oscar from now until the end of the season to win the Constructors' Championship if we tell him now, less than halfway through the year, if it was, say, Austria, oh, you're the number two now for the rest of the season? It's interesting because driver psychology, it can break a driver. And I've seen so many in recent years number two drivers, whether by name or de facto number two status, they do mental acrobats to then get themselves out of that situation for the following season. And I don't think, if McLaren did that for this year, I don't think that necessarily breaks Piastri, and it doesn't send him a message to say you're here as the number two forever. It's just specifically this season. It would be viable for them to turn around and say, actually, I think we've got a shot here. let's back one driver. And again, objectively, if you look at it in the championship positions and who has scored the most points, not just this season, but over not the last 3 races, but let's say the last half a dozen races, Lando's the driver that you have to back because he's going to have mathematically the best chance. I feel like they might just be more focused on the constructors at this stage because it's more winnable.
I do agree, and you do worry what it would do to Oscar in the short term anyway. I've been toying with this in my own mind. What if Oscar had won at Monaco, or if the strategy had played out and he'd won at Silverstone, if he already had that Grand Prix victory under his belt? Do you think they play it differently and actually be willing? Did they need him to get a win before they decided? And that's what I'm really sort of mulling over in my own mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think so. I think the way it played out in Hungary, at its most basic level, just reflected the way that McLaren is trying to run things, trying to exist as a team in the interest of essentially fairness, and also by backing themselves, actually living what they're asking of the drivers, because they're saying to the drivers, we need to trust you that you're going to act as team members, but they're also saying to them that you can trust us as well. To Oscar, it's we're going to make this strategic call, which was basically, it was an unnecessarily early undercut in Hungary, as you said, Will, but it was born out of, let's take the pressure off the pit crew, because we don't need to react this lap, but if we wait another lap or another 2 laps,
you've got to wait 3 laps, I think.
Daniel Ricciardo just weighing in on the debate, which is always good. We are recording this in the in the Red Bull Energy Station.
See, Daniel thinks that if they'd just waited a 3rd lap, that would have just ruined Piastri's race even more.
Yeah.
So
even bigger gap.
Yeah,
even bigger.
exactly.
It's fascinating what you say, and like roll back through McLaren history. You allow your drivers to fight each other. Look back to 07, Lewis and Fernando, equal points at the end of the year, but just one shy of Kimi, who won the title. But I'm thinking 08, and do you remember halfway through 08, Canada, Kubica wins the race, and BMW and Kubica are leading the championship. We all remember 08 as Lewis versus Felipe, but it wasn't. Robert was there as well, and BMW said, no, this isn't our year. We're not ready to fight for the title yet. We'll focus on that in 2009, and it never happened for them because they developed an absolute dog in 09, pulled out at the end of the year, and Robert's one shot at the title was gone. Surely, like, you never know when your shot is gonna come. If you have it, you take it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that, and with the way that they are handling it between the 2 drivers, I think. The one thing I would say about the 7 lost points for Lando in Hungary, because we can call them that, because if he'd held on, he would have had them. I will stand by this because I did put it on social media for the world to see, so I'm not going to back out of my position now. I do firmly believe, and I understand why maybe people don't necessarily get this or believe in it, I firmly believe that if the championship's going to be decided by such a fine margin, for those 7 points to have mattered, Lando's going to need Piastri and McLaren more times before the end of the year. So he could easily get back more than 7 points by Piastri ceding a team order in the year. Or if we're 2 or 3 races from the end and McLaren goes, Oscar, I know that you've led this race, you've led the Las Vegas Grand Prix brilliantly from start to finish. Lando's 2nd, Max is down in 5th. We need you to move aside.
But they might say, if you don't mind, could you possibly at your own convenience?
Yes,
it might
exactly.
take a while.
And so this is the issue as well from Hungary, was the really... I found it embarrassing, the calls that were being taken, that were being made, the kind of almost the guilt tripping being laid down. And where was team management in that moment? Why do you put all of that on the engineers? Why do you put it all on Will Joseph's back to try and to have to say, listen, I can't have your back on this. I can't protect you. Like that's crazy. Where was Andrea? Why didn't Andrea get on the all call and say, Lando, this is your boss. Get it done now.
Well, I think it was Will Joseph speaking with Andrea Stella's words. I feel like Andrea was in his ear. He was there with it. He's there on the pit wall. And I reckon if it had gone on a little longer, and especially if it had gone on to the point Lando said he was going to wait until the last lap to do it, then by then Andrea's been on the radio, I suspect, because it just felt the way that it was being taught. The messaging was very Andrea Stella, even though it wasn't his voice.
We could talk about the ifs, the buts, the shoulda, woulda, couldas all day long about Hungary. What are McLaren going to learn going forward in terms of how they communicate with the drivers, whether Andrea Stella gets involved a little more with strategy calls? What do they need to have learnt as well?
I think they need to finally recognise that they're in the championship. Red Bull have been saying for some time McLaren have the fastest car. I almost wish Lando had held on to that lead in Hungary and said, none of you guys seem to realise that we're in the hunt for the Drivers' World Championship, but I recognise it and I'm not giving up this win. I would have loved that, because they're a team at the moment that are failing to appreciate the position that they're in, and they're still making panicked, crazy decisions on the pit wall, or indecision. And indecision is still a decision. You decide not to decide something. You put too much decision making into your driver's hands. Again, we saw it over recent races. Oh, what tyre do you want to go on to, Lando? No, that's not his decision to make. That's the pit wall. You've got all the data. You've got everything that you need at your hands. Make that call. Be decisive. Roll the dice. And be proactive in your decision making, not reactive in your decision making when it comes to strategy. They're fumbling the ball too often. I think over the summer break, they've just got to get their house in order. They need calm, rational decision-making, and to recognise that they do have the fastest car in the sport at the moment, and these are their races to lose.
People are saying that it's because they're not used to being in this position, Scott. Do you buy that?
There's an art to being at the front in Formula One, and when you haven't been competing consistently at the front in Formula One for a very long time, which is what McLaren's had. They've had fleeting moments, but it's been over a decade since they were front runners to this degree. That means that you end up operating at a level where your mistakes aren't punished or exposed as harshly. So whether that is that strategic sharpness, whether that is how well briefed your driver is. For example, a couple of these moments where we've had split decisions on whether the driver should pit or shouldn't pit. Canada, for example, when the safety car comes out and Norris stays out. Silverstone, in terms of reading those conditions. I'm convinced that Verstappen and Red Bull, Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, in those situations, the driver knows if you see X, you box. If you feel this, you tell us. With Norris and McLaren as an example, it just always feels like a very lengthy two-way discussion, as if, because it's not the first time that they're considering it. Of course they've had these conversations in advance, but it doesn't come across that way. So I think that's the stuff that they're learning, and they've been learning it more or less against an almost relentless opposition in the form of Verstappen and Red Bull. They have started to drop points, they've started to show some cracks, they've started to be exposed a little bit under pressure, but up until recently in this season, they have barely done that, and they were showing Lando and McLaren just how hard it is to be that good week in, week out.
We'll talk about Red Bull very shortly, but let's hear from Lando Norris heading into the Belgian Grand Prix weekend.
We've reviewed everything, but like you're saying, main point is we had a 1-2, and I was super happy with that. The whole team were very happy. Could I have done things probably a little bit differently? Yes, but that's from my side and the team's side to discuss, and that's what we've done. So coming into this weekend to try and repeat it in terms of result.
How much have you spoken with Oscar and Andrea since then, and is everything clear for this weekend and moving into the rest of the season?
I've spoken quite a bit and everything's clear, so good to go.
And what about your chances here and the battle in general? A couple of tougher races for Red Bull, so does it really feel like momentum's on your side and the future's very bright? I
mean, we're just in good shape, we're in good form at the minute. I think so Red Bull are very quick. Last weekend, Max maybe didn't have the best race, but he was 400th off pole, and if he was on pole, he probably could have been close to converting it to a win, So I think things can change so quickly and quicker than people realise. But the main thing is, yes, we have good momentum and the team are doing a good job. I feel like I'm doing a good job, and continue that for as long as possible.
That was Lando Norris speaking a little earlier on here at the Spa-Francorchamps circuit, the setting for this weekend's Grand Prix. Let's turn our attention now to Red Bull. Scott, you were chatting just a couple of minutes ago about how Red Bull are starting to show some cracks. I'm always going to have to whisper that because we are sitting in the Red Bull Energy Station. I don't want to be thrown out. But they are starting to appear, and frustration is starting to be shown and heard on the radio by Max Verstappen. That was super evident last weekend in Hungary. What is going on?
I've never heard him speak like that or be spoken to like that. That we have come to recognise Max's relationship with GP, Gianpiero Lambiase, his race engineer, for a very long time. That we know that they're blunt. We know that they talk to each other in a way that actually you very rarely, if ever, hear a driver speak to their race engineer unless they're having a go at them. But that's kind of how they converse in the car, because the race engineer is kind of part psychologist. It's often a like one-way venting system. The driver just gets a lot of stuff off their chest so that they can focus on the task at hand. This felt like more than that. And especially against the backdrop of a weekend in which Verstappen said more than once He doesn't feel that everybody in the team's on the same wavelength as him. That maybe some people in the team don't recognise the severity of the situation that they're in, with upgrades that aren't working as well as they want them to, the fact that they're coming under pressure, that they don't have the fastest car. I get the impression that Max is starting to feel like there are too many people who almost aren't meeting his standards, because they kind of feel like the championships are not won, but they're still in a really good position. And he's kind of been warning for a very long time, we will lose this control. And I think he feels that he hasn't been listened to.
If he is listened to, Will, what do you think are the consequences? People going to go? Max going to go from Red Bull?
No, I don't think Max is going to leave Red Bull. We learned this week Helmut Marko's just signed a continuation on his deal, which keeps him there, and the threat of Helmut leaving would have sprung a clause in Max's contract that would have allowed him to leave. So I don't think he's going anywhere. I do find it interesting, 2 races this year where Max has really seemingly lost his mind, Austria and Hungary, and they're the only 2 races I can recall that his dad was present at. And we know that there's been a huge ruction between his father, Christian Horner, and Red Bull as a whole. And I just wonder how much that might have played out over the weekend. A lot's been made of the fact he was up until 3 a.m. on iRacing or whatever. And then, you get these calls to him like, stop being childish. And now Helmut Marko's said he's not doing iRacing anymore on Grand Prix weekends. It's like, they've sort of said, go to your room without dinner. I'm taking the Wi-Fi passcode and I'm taking your PlayStation. No toys. And we'll talk about it in the morning, and you will apologise to GP tomorrow, young man. Act like a child, get treated like a child.
I think what happened in Hungary was a level more severe than Austria, because in Austria there was the needless off-track juvenile actions between his father and Christian, that they were bickering over Jos's participation in the demonstration that weekend. But ultimately it's going to be things like Hungary, things like doubting whether or not everybody's on your side, everyone is working in the right direction. That stuff's way more meaningful than has my dad had another argument with Horn. I know he doesn't like it, but it's
where are those voices coming from in his head that's making him that aggressive or putting that seed of doubt in his mind? Because it doesn't come from nowhere. And I don't know. I'm not saying that it is, but the correlation between 2 weekends where Max really seemed to revert back to the Max of 2020, 2021 were those 2 weekends where his father was present. And we know how important a support network is for a driver and how it can have a positive and negative effect. Some drivers have to stop their girlfriends coming to races because their head's just not in the right space. You need those right people around you. And I just don't know, with the relationship between Jos and the team at the moment, if his presence is a help or a hindrance to it.
Well, I think he has to be here he has to behave to be here, I think, is kind of the unofficial agreement that's been struck between them. Basically, he's been to more races than just those 2, but I think the bigger correlation is probably the 2 races where he's lost control the most. Not in terms of himself in his head, as in lost control of the weekend. In Austria, the race was going away from him, he was coming under pressure from Lando and he lost it, which I think had a bigger bearing than the off-track rumblings that weekend. And then in Hungary, they were just on the back foot the whole weekend. That's the first weekend this season that the McLaren has emphatically been the fastest car over 1 lap and the whole Grand Prix distance, rather than just individual stints. I think those are the moments. I think that's where it's coming from, because Max has sky-high standards. He's so single-minded in the pursuit of winning. And if he's not winning, it almost doesn't even matter to him. You could offer him the World Championship now, and he would go, but I don't care if that means I can't win more races. Because he's only interested in 1 race weekend at a time.
It's first time since 2021 that he's gone 3 races in a row without standing on that top step of the podium, and that's going to start needling him.
Especially when he thinks it's a result of him not being listened to, because he's been pointing out limitations in this car for a while. The upgrades keep coming and they keep not fixing the thing that he wants to be fixed, and then you then look at then all of a sudden individual strategy mistakes during the race, rows that wouldn't have seemed like anything a couple of months ago with his race engineer suddenly feel bigger, and everything just gets escalated basically.
Well, will he be back on the top step of the podium this weekend in Belgium? Of course, he won here last year. There could be a penalty coming his way this weekend. Still not sure about that, but let's hear how Max Verstappen is feeling coming into this Grand Prix before the summer break.
Some decisions could have been probably a bit better. That's what was very frustrating, because I know that in a tight battle you need to make the right calls. Now, I think for most of the time. The team has always done a very good job at that. And I think they've always been praised for it as well. But when things are, not correct or not good, it needs to be said as well. Now, some people might be a bit more vocal on that than others, maybe drivers or how the team operates, but that's how we operate. And yeah, maybe some people, they don't like the approach. I advise to turn down the volume or not listen at all, because that's how I am. I'm very driven. I always want the best. Now, I know that we are not robots and we cannot be perfect every single time, but you have to always strive for that. You always need to try and be perfect. And we analyze all of that, and you move on from that, and you just, try to, figure out what went wrong and try to do better here.
Of course, there aren't many days to improve for this weekend. Thoughts about taking a penalty? I imagine that's on your mind, and you've been vocal about the fact that you have a deficit when it comes to quali and race pace. So are you actually going to be able to make up any places come Sunday?
I think overall, of course, it will always be a bit of a tough weekend with that. Of course, we need to see as well how competitive we are in general, plus what the weather is doing in terms of your preparation for the race on Sunday. But yeah, naturally, when you're not the quickest for the last 2 races, I don't expect a repeat scenario of the last 2 weekends here, the last 2 years. So, we'll try to do the best we can, try to, of course, get the best result out of it and move on.
Well, I said at the start of the show that there are quite a few storylines. We could talk, I think, forever about what's going on in the F1 world at the moment. We must just focus in on the Belgian Grand Prix a little, though, in terms of who might go well here. Can McLaren back what we saw in Hungary up with another win, maybe even another 1-2? What about Mercedes? Can Ferrari get on top of the bouncing that suddenly started with their upgrade that they brought a few races ago? Who are you seeing as the front runners this weekend, Will?
Mercedes are hoping for a cooler weekend to kind of play towards their strengths, and as I understand it, we're going to get rain Friday and Saturday, then dry on Sunday. So it could be a real mix-up. But no, I'm expecting Mercedes to be up there and punching. But yeah, I think it's going to be McLaren versus Red Bull again.
It should be a track that suits the Red Bull. And I think we should also physically see the Red Bull back into a more familiar configuration and look, because the very different bodywork that it had on the car around the engine and the side pods in Hungary is a high downforce specification. They shouldn't need that here, which is an interesting and very ambitious technical direction to go down, because trying to optimise both of those on the go is potentially the kind of thing that can trip you up, especially when you don't seem to be on top of everything as it is. So it should be a Red Bull weekend, but even those weekends now aren't straightforward. The McLaren will be close, even if they're not outright fastest. But the person who's probably the only person in the entire paddock who's hoping it's a Red Bull weekend more than Verstappen is probably Perez.
Well, this is it. If Max takes a 10-place grid penalty, which we expect him to, Perez has got to get the job done. And he's under massive pressure right now because Red Bull's operating a one-car team. Imagine a scenario where Checo doesn't out-qualify Max, even with Max's 10-place grid penalty. It's curtains.
It's the ultimate test of what they need from their second driver, because the first driver is literally being removed from the picture. He is not going to start if it's going to be, even if it's just the bare minimum 10-place penalty, he is not going to start in the top 10. Checo needs to be up there if the car's the quickest, he needs to be on pole. At the very least, he's got to be on the front row, and then he has to be fighting for the win if Verstappen's best projection coming through the field is third or something like that. And when you're in basically it's his final race before the break, which is when Red Bull will decide, do we keep this guy for the rest of the year? Can we win the World Championship with him in the second car, or do we need to make a change? It's not one race defines everything, but it's going to go a long way, I think, because it'll either confirm the negative trend, or it will build on Hungary and the race performance there and offer a little bit of hope.
See, another storyline, absolutely bonkers. Checo Perez signs his contract at the beginning of June, and here we are at the end of July talking about him being out of the sport. It is a wild ride, this 2024 season. There's lots of other business, but we will try and get through that over the course of the weekend here in Belgium. My thanks to Will Buxton and to Scott Mitchell-Mom for joining me to preview what's going to be an exciting Belgian Grand Prix. You can listen to the race via the BBC Sport website and your smart speaker of choice on Sunday afternoon. Our coverage begins at 1:45. We'll be back tomorrow for the 2 practice sessions. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live. Next up, it's Gordon Smart. But first, it's time for the BBC News.